The wedding dress weighed more than young Isabel of France. At just 6 years old, she could barely walk under the weight of the luxurious golden silk adorned with jewels. The ambience inside St. Paul's Cathedral was grandiose, with hundreds of candles casting flickering lights against the Gothic windows. The organ's powerful notes reverberated through the stone halls as nobles from both England and France looked on. A child bride was about to be wed, stepping forward to meet the 29-year-old man who would soon declare her his queen. What follows is an unraveling of a shocking story, a tale long buried by medieval chroniclers who sought to obscure the disturbing truths of how children were manipulated in the royal games of power. This wasn't a practice lost to ancient barbaric cultures from faraway lands. This took place in London, in France, at the zenith of medieval civilization. What you're about to learn will forever change your understanding of European royalty and their treatment of their own offspring. On November 9th, 1389, the rooms of the Louvre Palace echoed not with the cries of a newborn, but with anguished screams. King Charles VI of France was experiencing another of his episodes, convinced he was made of glass and would shatter with a single touch. Palace guards were ordered to keep their distance as the king cowered, fearing invisible foes were seeking him out within his very halls. Elsewhere in the palace, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria gave birth to her fourth daughter. The midwives exchanged glances filled with a burdensome realization: another girl, another pawn in the political chess game, to be traded when her time came. The newborn was named Isabel, and in that moment from her first breath she was far more than just a child. She was currency. While many 6-year-olds faced the simple worries of learning to read or making friends, Isabel was being aped into a living treaty. Her toys were not mere dolls, but miniature representations of courts where she was taught the art of diplomatic ceremony. Her bedtime stories weren't tales of wonder, but lessons in statecraft. But how did a young girl end up wed to a man old enough to be her father? To understand this, we need to dissect the decaying core of the French royal family. Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad, was not always insane. Something in his mind snapped during a military campaign at the age of 24. One moment he was leading his troops, and in the next he was frenziedly attacking his own men, believing them to be assassins. These episodes arrived in waves. Sometimes he was the cultured king France desired, and other times he would discard his clothes and run through the palace halls, forget his own identity, or worse, forget he had a family. Medieval medicine had little to offer. Bloodletting and exorcism were tried in vain. Thus, France found itself ruled by a madman, while opportunists lurked in the shadows. Isabeau of Bavaria, Isabel's mother, stood as the chief opportunist. While others lamented the king's madness, Isabeau saw opportunity. More power to seize, more wealth to accumulate, more lovers to indulge while her husband was incapacitated. Chronicles of the time, intended to portray royals favorably, could not entirely conceal their disdain. One chronicler wrote that Isabeau was captivated more by her jewels than her children, more by her pleasures than her prayers. Another noted that she kept at least 3 lovers during the king's episodes, sometimes entertaining them nearby as Charles was physically restrained. This was the woman who was raising young Isabel. This was her example of motherhood. Isabel's childhood at the Louvre Palace was a labyrinth of intrigue and conspiracies. Factions like the Armagnacs and the Burgundians vied for influence over the ailing king. Assassination attempts were frequent, and poison was a looming concern. Noble children played not in gardens, but in fortified courtyards, shielded against crossbow bolts. Isabel learned to recognize the signs of her father's approaching episodes before she could even read. She watched his eyes nervously dart about the room, his hands tremble, and the silence that preluded chaos. At just 4 years old, she witnessed him attempt to kill her mother, deluded into believing that Isabeau was a demon sent to steal his soul. Here's a heartbreaking revelation hidden in the dusty annals of history. In 1394, when Isabel was 5, the royal treasury funded the installation of iron bars on her bedroom windows, not for decoration and not for security against external threats, but to prevent the young princess from jumping out. Even at such a tender age, death seemed preferable to the life she endured. This was merely preparation for what lay ahead. In 1395, English emissaries arrived with a proposal that would alleviate many of France's troubles and unleash nightmares upon one small girl. Richard II of England, bereft of his first wife Anne of Bohemia, and without heirs, faced restive nobles and an empty treasury depleted by constant warfare. He needed peace, he needed funds. The French council saw the potential to secure nearly 3 decades of peace with a single transaction: the life of a 6-year-old girl, Isabel. The negotiations that followed were monstrous. Grown men draped in velvet robes sat behind mahogany tables, bartering over a child like she was a mere commodity at a market. The English balked at Isabel's tender age, knowing that even by medieval standards, 6 was exceptionally young. Most royal brides were at least 12, with a chance to survive childbearing. The French countered with a chilling argument. Isabel's youth was an advantage. Raised in England, she would be molded entirely according to Richard's desires. She would become more completely his. This was not merely a marriage arrangement, it was state-sanctioned grooming. Before sealing the deal, the English delegates demanded to inspect Isabel, akin to examining livestock. French courtiers paraded her, allowing the delegates to scrutinize her teeth, her posture, and her hair, making her walk to verify that she bore no deformities. One English lord was overheard predicting she would ripen beautifully. She was only 6. Ultimately, the agreement was reached in the summer of 1396. France would provide 800,000 livres, an astronomical amount equivalent to 2 years of English royal income, in exchange for peace and the marriage of Isabel to Richard II. However, the marriage contract, preserved in the English National Archives, holds a chilling clause often ignored by modern historians. It specified that while the marriage would not be consummated until Isabel was of suitable age, Richard would have all other rights of a husband immediately. This meant he controlled her residence, education, acquaintances, and even shared her bed, since medieval norms believed young brides should acclimate to their husband's presence. The document signed away her childhood. When they told Isabel she was to become Queen of England, she had one innocent question, as recorded by her governess. "Will I be able to bring my dolls?" It was the question of a little girl still tethered to her toys, still needing help with her hair, and still crying over scraped knees. The French court plunged into preparations for Isabel's wedding with unnerving vigor. Seamstresses toiled day and night to create a trousseau fit for a queen. 12 wedding gowns, 40 ceremonial robes, and heirloom jewels resized for a child's frame. Isabeau of Bavaria oversaw every detail personally, more invested in her daughter's wedding than she had been in her childhood, seeing this event as her own political victory. Court poets extolled Isabeau's wisdom in verse. None celebrated the little girl's plight. In October 1396, a farewell ceremony at the Louvre became a masterpiece of political theatre. Charles VI, in a rare lucid moment, blessed his daughter, tears streaming down. Witnesses claimed he held her so tightly they had to pry open his arms. He whispered something that made Isabel sob inconsolably. We'll never know what those final words were, but long after they left Paris, servants reported her cries for her father, until her voice faltered. The journey from Paris to Calais took 2 weeks. 2 long weeks for a terrified child being carried away from everything familiar. Her French attendants later testified she barely ate or slept, clutching a small hardwood doll until her fingers bled. In Calais, the handover mimicked a hostage exchange. It was precisely that. The English had constructed a tent city along the beach, silk pavilions adorned with Richard's standards. Acrobats and musicians entertained, creating a festive mood as the 6-year-old prize stood at the center. The exchange itself was unnervingly choreographed. French nobles escorted Isabel to the designated midpoint of a measured field, where English nobles awaited. Words spoken in Latin, incomprehensible to Isabel, were said. Papers were signed, gold switched hands. Just like that, Isabel was now an English possession. Yet, the real disillusionment begins here, where history's rosy farce decrumbles. Immediately afterward, Isabel was separated from her French companions. Her lifelong governess was sent back, her ladies exchanged for English attendants who didn't speak her language. Even her little dog, promised company on this journey, was taken because Richard loathed small dogs. In just an hour, they stripped away each familiar element of her life. The trek from Calais to London was a bewildering procession of unknown faces and foreign tongues. Towns along their path were ordered to celebrate the new queen. But imagine a 6-year-old's terror. Strangers shouting in an alien language, clanging bells and pressing throngs. Isabel later confided to her confessor she thought this was a march to her own execution. In her child's mind, all this grandeur could only lead to her death. November 1396 arrived in London as never before. Richard II had lavished a fortune to display his wealth, awe his subjects, and intimidate his adversaries. Westminster Palace gleamed in cloth of gold. The Thames flourished with elaborately decorated barges. Church bells clanged the entire day. St. Paul's Cathedral, transformed into a scene out of fantasy, welled with the smoke of incense, glimmered with thousands of candles, and displayed banners of the united arms of England and France. An altar, cloaked in gold, awaited a small girl and a grown man. Richard II appeared tall and elegant, fitted in robes of such opulence they surpassed most nobles' entire holdings. Nervous, but not for moral dilemmas, he worried over politics. Would this marriage afford him time to quell internal threats? Would France pay the full dowry? Would his court accept a wife unable to bear heirs for at least 6 years? Morality seemed a distant concern. As Isabel entered the cathedral, attendees reportedly gasped, not in admiration but in outright shock. She was dwarfed by her ceremonial robes, 2 attendants necessary to manage the train behind her. Even a specially crafted crown wobbled atop her head, requiring frequent adjustments. Led as if in confinement down the endless aisle, she proceeded toward Richard, waiting with the patience of a spider. The Archbishop of Canterbury officiated, kneeling to reach Isabel's height. When asked if she consented, she was engulfed by terror and rendered wordless. An English lady near her softly prompted, feeding her the requisite phrases in a whisper. Isabel repeated them, a mere whisper only barely audible to nearby guests. "I will." These 2 words bound her to a life of entrapment. During the exchange of rings, Richard's hands enveloped hers entirely. Witnesses said Isabel flinched at his touch. The child-sized ring, specially made, required force to fit over her small finger. She winced with the effort. For the kiss of peace, an integral part of medieval matrimonial rites, Richard kissed her forehead instead of her lips. A single, merciful gesture amid the grotesquely orchestrated display. Thus concluded the ceremony, proclaiming her as Isabel of England, wife to a man who could have been her father. Cheers erupted, bells clanged, and coins were scattered among the celebrating poor. Meanwhile, at the altar, a tear-streaked 6-year-old could only wonder why anyone would find joy in her life's worst day. The reception at Westminster Hall invited 2,000 guests, indulging in feasts that could sustain villages for a lifetime. Swans encased in peacock feathers, boars' heads adorned with gold, rare wines flowing freely, and entertainment comprising musicians, jesters, and acrobats. But at the high table, Isabel's specially placed elevated chair sat untouched. She could not eat, and the Archbishop of York, seated closely, wrote she appeared as though her spirit had vacated, leaving merely an empty vessel behind. Despite all this, the most revolting aspect loomed ahead. Medieval traditions demanded public observation of wedding nights, not the consummation, even medieval sensibilities weren't that depraved, but the ceremony of bedding. The bride would be undressed by her attendants, blessed and placed to bed, then joined by the groom before curtains inscribed with this, the night finalized. When Isabel inquired about the possibility of returning home, the answer was always a resounding never. However, this tale takes an unexpected twist following her marriage. Despite being part of this monstrous arrangement, Richard II seemed to treat Isabel with uncommon gentleness. After their wedding, he established her in her own household at Windsor Castle, surrounding her with French-speaking attendants that he had personally recruited. He visited frequently but ensured they maintained separate bedchambers. Richard showered her with gifts, not jewels or gowns, but rather toys, books, and a small white pony she named Blanche. Was this genuine kindness or a form of grooming? Historians still debate this point. What is evident is that Isabel gradually began to trust her husband. She learned English, participated in court ceremonies, and even started to show affection for Richard, whom she referred to as "my lord uncle," a child's attempt to comprehend their complex relationship. Richard, in turn, appeared genuinely fond of her, commissioning portraits depicting them together with her tiny hand resting on his arm, and writing poems celebrating innocence and protection. He issued harsh punishments to anyone who disrespected the Queen. However, one must not confuse this with a redemption arc. A kind captor remains a captor, and a gentle predator is still a paw. Redata. A child bride treated well continues to be just that, a child bride. Life at the English court eventually settled into a bizarre rhythm. Isabel attended state functions where she was exhibited like an exotic pet. Foreign ambassadors often remarked on how well-trained she appeared, noting her ability to recite English poetry and perform intricate court dances. Meanwhile, her private life betrayed her youth and vulnerability. She still played with dolls and experienced nightmares that had her screaming for her father, who was an ocean away. Her ladies-in-waiting had to coax her to eat as she was wasting away from homesickness. English nobles were divided in their reception of her. Some, eager to align themselves with political wins, fawned over the child queen. Others, resentful of French influence and the substantial dowry that had nearly bankrupted the English crown, treated her with poorly concealed disdain. One notable incident that stands out amidst the sanitized histories highlights the daily horrors Isabel faced. During a state banquet, a drunken nobleman made a crude joke about when the young queen would be ready for breeding. The hall erupted in laughter. Unaware of the sexual implications but cognizant of the mockery, Isabel burst into tears and fled the table. Richard punished the nobleman severely, nearly flogging him to death, but did little to curtail the culture that allowed such jokes to flourish. The situation in France was unraveling as well. Charles VI's madness worsened, and Isabeau of Bavaria's corrupt endeavors grew bolder, pushing the country towards civil war. The 800,000 livres dowry meant to secure peace was squandered within 2 years on Richard's extravagant building projects and unsuccessful military campaigns. Isabel received heavily censored letters from home and wrote back whenever she could, her missives filled with longing. "I pray for you all daily," one reads. Another, more heartbreaking. "Do you still remember me? I fear you have forgotten your Isabel. She was 7 years old, already worried about being forgotten." In 1399, her world turned upside down. Richard II's rule, increasingly tyrannical, crumbled. He'd exiled or executed many nobles, governed without parliament, and spent lavishly on unnecessary projects. The final straw came when he seized the lands of Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster. Henry raised an army, and Richard's support evaporated. In August 1399, the king who wed a child for power became a prisoner in his realm. Isabel, once queen, found herself a 10-year-old widow overnight. Richard was taken to Pontefract Castle, where he would succumb to a mysterious death, suspected by some to be starvation, others axe murder. Isabel was not permitted to see him or bid him farewell, the last sight of him being dragged away in chains as she screamed his name. Isabel then became a problem for the new king, Henry IV. As per the law, she was still Queen of England, but her dowry had been squandered. Sending her home meant reimbursing non-existent funds, whereas keeping her entailed maintaining a living reminder of the old regime. Henry's solution was harsh, yet pragmatic. He imprisoned Isabel in Havering Palace under the guise of an honoured guest, albeit one forbidden from leaving, receiving uncensored letters or having French visitors. From ages 10 to 13, instead of learning, growing and playing, Isabel was a political prisoner in a foreign land that had destroyed the only person who had shown her kindness. Her letters from this period, dismissed by historians, reveal a child losing hope. "I am forgotten by all," she wrote, and "I dream of home, but wake to prison." In a poignant letter to her father, she pleads, "I pray for your recovery. I pray you remember you have a daughter in England who loves you still. Most devastating of all, Wewe," was an unsent letter to Richard found hidden in her chambers. "My lord, they say you are dead, but I do not believe it. You promised you would protect me always. I wait for you still, your Isabel." Here was a 13-year-old waiting for a dead man to rescue her, a testament to the devastating consequences of political strife and machinations. Henry IV then tried to marry Isabel to his son, the future Henry V, but she refused, proclaiming, "I am Richard's widow. I will marry no English prince." Her refusal marked a significant departure from her previously compliant demeanour. Subsequently, Henry planned to keep her in England indefinitely as a leverage for French compliance, but Isabel proved resourceful and resilient. She established a network of supporters, feigned illness to communicate through French-speaking doctors, and used her status to demand privileges that facilitated her covert activities. French pressure, prompted by Isabel's entreaties and a rare moment of lucidity from her father, Charles VI, led to negotiations for her return. Talks dragged on as both sides haggled over compensations for the squandered dowry and her prolonged captivity. Eventually, her father demanded her return, precipitating her departure in 1401. At age 13, Isabel finally returned to France, but she was no longer the child who had left. Witnesses described her as prematurely aged, haunted by melancholy and memories of captivity. Her reunion with her family was far from the joyful occasion she'd envisioned. Her father no longer recognized her, consumed by insanity once more, and her mother saw in her only a diminished political asset. Back in France, amidst the turbulence of civil war, Isabelle faced new challenges. The political landscape was fraught with danger, and turmoil followed her wherever she went, underscoring the harsh reality that her nightmare was far from over, merely assuming a different shape. Isabelle of France's story is one of profound tragedy, hidden beneath the veneer of medieval politics and power. Born into a world where she was little more than a pawn, her life was a series of transactions and tragedies that began when she was sold into marriage at the tender age of 6. Stripped of the innocence of childhood, Isabelle found herself ensnared in the web of dynastic ambitions. In 1406, seeking a swift solution to a seemingly desperate situation, her family's machinations arranged for Isabelle to marry Charles, the Duke of Orléans. Unlike her previous experiences, Charles offered her a glimpse of something she had never known: love. A dreamer and a poet, Charles matched her in age and temperament, bringing a sense of delicate joy into Isabelle's tumultuous life. For the first time, she experienced tenderness, reminiscent of a life she could have known, had her existence not been defined by the selfish aspirations of others. In 1409, Isabelle gave birth to a daughter, Jeanne. Motherhood illuminated a joy in Isabelle that no one had witnessed before. She now had someone who was truly hers to love and protect. But the birth was fraught with difficulties. Her young body was already ravaged by years of malnutrition, stress, and trauma. The incompetent physicians, who had failed to cure the madness of a king, could do nothing to save a dying queen. As life slipped away from her at just 20 years old, Isabelle made one last request: to hold her daughter once more. Whispering unheard words into her baby's ear, those final moments belonged only to them. On September 13, 1409, Isabelle of France passed away, leaving behind a mere 3 lines in court chronicles dedicated to her death. These lines focused on the political ramifications rather than recognizing the human tragedy of a life stolen too soon. For centuries, her story lingered in the shadows of official histories, buried in the margins and archived letters that only scratched the surface of her suffering. Isabelle's life was never a fairy tale. She was a child offered up on the altar of politics. Her suffering was cloaked in silk and called diplomacy, a reminder of the grim realities behind the romanticized views of medieval times. The horror of Isabelle's life was not isolated. She stood as a representative of countless others, children like Margaret of Anjou and Philippa of England, who were traded as commodities for political alliances. These girls, whose names history often overlooked, endured similar fates. Yet Isabelle's story has persisted as a testament to these forgotten lives, pieced together through fragments that reveal the truth. As we continue to admire the romances of the medieval era, let us not forget Isabelle's story. She symbolizes the children who cried for their parents when taken away, asked if they could bring their dolls to an unwanted union, and died before fully living. Her death was not the result of a single event, but a continuous cycle of misuse and neglect, orchestrated by those wielding power. Isabelle's gravestone states she was a queen and a duchess, but it should have marked her as a victim of a society that commodified children. Her story is a reminder of the tragic costs of these ambitions. In remembering her, we honor not just her life, but the countless lives sacrificed like hers, acknowledging her pain and hoping to prevent history from repeating itself. If Isabelle's story moved you, consider learning about Catherine Howard, another young girl whose history demands our acknowledgement. Subscribe for more revelations and join me in uncovering these hidden truths from the past.